Passage this morning is from the Gospel of Luke. We're going to read Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you were set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. It's a sacred scripture for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Jesus healing on the Sabbath. Now, if you've been in church for any time, really, you've probably got wind of the fact that Jesus did heal on the Sabbath. And for him, in his time, that was like, that was a taboo. But there are several different stories in the gospel about Jesus healing on the Sabbath. This is just one of them. You know, I think some of the ones in John that have a lot more symbolism associated with it are some of the more fascinating ones. Like, you remember the paralyzed man. He's laying by the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem. And because he's paralyzed, he really can't help himself much. But the reason he's laying by this pool is because there's this tradition that an angel would occasionally come and stir the waters of the pool. And so when the waters were stirred, when the people saw this visible bubbling or reaction in the water, whoever could get into the pool first would be healed from whatever malady they had. And when Jesus came across this man who basically had been in this state for over 40 years, and he asked him why he's laying there, he's telling them, I want to be healed, but I just can't get in there fast enough. I got nobody to help me. And Jesus heals this man, and it is the Sabbath, and there's a lot of hoo-ha about it, but not nearly as much as what happens a little bit later in John when there's a man born blind from birth. Now, this is significant because, being blind for most people is a matter of losing their sight. And if somebody can correct that sight, your brain's already been wired to use it. And so when your sight is restored, it's a beautiful thing. But can you imagine how difficult it would be if you were born blind, never saw anything, and your sight was then given to you as an adult? There was actually a movie about that. Forget the name of the movie. It's probably 25 years old now. Had Val Kilmer in it. And it was the case with him. And the situation of having sight given to him as an adult was so traumatic that he actually went back to being blind. He had the doctor reverse the process because he had learned to live life blind, but given his sight, now what he had was this confusion and distortion of senses he never used before and had never been taught to use. And so he was doing things like walking through glass doors and such, simply because of not understanding depth perception. And so in this story in the gospel that's very, very symbolic, the idea is that in the giving sight to this blind man who had never had sight to begin with, is it doesn't matter how far away you are from the truth of God. When it is revealed to you, it is glorious. And it is something to cherish and put first and foremost, which was the case in the story in the book of John, because the man himself, because Jesus healed him on the Sabbath, ended up being cast out of the synagogue. All right? They couldn't take their anger out on Jesus because he wasn't available, and so he took it out on the man that healed him. Why? Because it was the Sabbath. Now, all these healing on the Sabbath stories, they have a common theme, and it is it's typically elaborated on from the pulpit as our spiritual do's and don'ts that become part of our religious traditions and whatnot should never outweigh what is really important to God. And what's really important to God in any and every instance, no exceptions at all, is showing compassion and love to those that need it. And so regardless of the circumstances, if there's a need, we are to try to meet it. The story that I read this morning, though, I'm going to take a little bit different direction because it says something very interesting towards the end, where Jesus actually challenges the people that are trying to hold this situation up as what you don't do in society. You don't disrupt something so important to the social order as the sacred observance of Sabbath. And Jesus challenges them by saying, which one of you, if your own interests were endangered on the Sabbath, would deal with it? Oh, you might not say anything to anybody else, but I bet you your conscience wouldn't be bothering you either. You know, if your animal needs assistance, you're going to take care of your livestock, even though it's the Sabbath. Because what takes priority to you and your interests is preserving your animal, right? And the big difference in how we view whether you can or cannot do something that violates the norm is exactly how much of your own interest is involved. If there's not much of your interest involved, there's no excuse. But if you got an interest, then you expect an exception. Yeah. We're always thinking the law can be bent for us because we're good people. But Jesus was railing against was not so much the religious order as he was the social order. You have to realize the big difference between Jesus and us today. Now, today, we have separation of church and state in our country. If you've been raised in the United States, you've been raised with that to a large degree. Now, you know, it's not always separation of church and state like they're supposed to be, but that's a big principle of our country. And so if you have a problem in your church, in your denomination, religion in general, it doesn't necessarily impact your social interactions, your social life, your career, etc., those kind of things. Jesus lived at a different time under different circumstances. His people lived under a society that thrived on their religious traditions. And so that system of government would be called a theocracy. It's a government that's also based on religious beliefs. So when we read about the Sabbath and whatnot, it's not like this is just taking place in the synagogue. The Sabbath observance, it impacted the entire community. And so what's going on in this story is a challenge to the whole social structure of that day in the name of compassion. And that's what makes the story very, very different. Thank God we live in a country today where we don't have to worry about that kind of thing, right? I mean, our social system, you know, I haven't lived long, but I've lived enough to experience some things. And I've also spent a great deal of my life learning and researching things. And I'm a big history buff. And I can tell you that there's never been a time in human history where the social order was a perfect order. It always has flaws. It's just the nature of the beast. But we have to have them because we're social animals, and without social systems, social structure, social order, then life is going to be really, really tough. We've got to have those things. But that doesn't mean that we should turn a blind eye to the system's faults, its shortcomings, when they impact people negatively. Our propensity is to not worry about the system impacting people negatively if it's not our people. But you know what? A hard lesson the Germans learned in World War II is that everybody should be our people. When we start allowing ourselves to be defined by the classifications and labels slapped on us, whether it's through race or ethnicity or nationality or sexuality, whatever the case may be, we are basically dehumanizing people when we allow that to happen. And that is the very, very last thing that Jesus would suggest. As a matter of fact, it wouldn't even be the last thing. It would never be suggested by Jesus. And it is one of the primary features of the love of God that he revealed to us. And so we must adhere to it. And in our country, in our current world affairs, the opportunity to exercise the same type of sensitivity to all and courage to speak up for the less fortunate surrounds us. And we should be part of the solution to the social system problems, and not part of the problem by allowing them to be perpetuated just because they don't impact us personally at this time. A few years ago, great example of this occurred in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It was 2014. Now, Fort Lauderdale had just passed an ordinance. And the ordinance was, it was illegal to give out food publicly. Illegal to give out food publicly. Now, we're not talking about like a street vendor who's selling food, a food truck, a restaurant, anything that we think of in terms of food services, because what's the deal there? You pay for it, right? No, this was nothing wrong with selling people food. It was you couldn't give food publicly. Now you're probably scratching your head saying, why would they come up with a law like that? Right? But hey, it made perfect sense. Fort Lauderdale is a tourist town. They make lots and lots of money by people coming and visiting their city. They want their city to be attractive and comfortable to people visiting. Furthermore, the people that have to live in that city that are of the aristocracy, the movers and shakers, they don't want to drive down the street and see something unpleasant in their city. And homelessness was becoming more and more of a problem in the city. And so the ordinance was passed to discourage homelessness. Well, if it's illegal to feed them, then maybe they won't hang around as much. Maybe people won't be as disposed to become homeless if it's not so easy to be homeless. As if in high school, kids are going to their guidance counselor to find out whether or not they really want to get a career or it would behoove them to be homeless instead. You know, that people don't foresee that as the target for their lives, right? And so this discussion of homelessness was completely abstract. It was not taking into consideration that homelessness is about homeless people like you and me who need to eat every day, who need shelter, need clothing, who need basic needs met. But you know what? If every one of our basic needs were met, we still wouldn't be satisfied because our lives are so full that our other activities are so much a part of what we seek in life that if all our basic needs were met, we would still have needs. We would have the need for love and compassion from a support group. We would have need of activities and interchange. How do you think games came into the world? Games are one of the oldest activities of humanity. Why? To allow people to do things together, to occupy their minds and make life worth living, so to speak. Well, we're not even talking about those things. We're talking about the basic things in life that at a societal level, we have governments, in this case, the local Fort Lauderdale government, say, we're not responsible for helping people with those kind of things. And if they want them, they just need to go somewhere else. They just need to go somewhere else. Can you hear Jesus saying that? Because I sure can't. I sure can't. But anyhow, let me get back to the story. Now, there was a man. His name is Arnold Abbott. And at this time, in 2014, he was 90 years old. He was a World War II veteran. He ran his own social service called Love Thy Neighbor. And what he would do himself personally would go every Wednesday to Fort Lauderdale Beach at 5:30 p.m. with all the food he could pull together to feed the homeless. Week after week. He had done this for 23 years. The ordinance comes out the next Wednesday. Arnold's at the beach being arrested. Being arrested. He is now a criminal for what yesterday he was called a hero for. That's how our system works. And he was threatened with 60 days in jail and a $500 fine. He was breaking the law. He was risking his reputation in society. He was risking his freedom. He was risking his finances. And he needed to stop right now. The next Wednesday, he's at the beach again. And the Wednesday after, he got arrested a lot of times. He got a lot of citations. He never had to spend any time in jail or pay any fine, only because of the public outcry that occurred when his story came to light. Thank God for that. Thank God that there were enough people to put pressure on this very unjust system. Unfortunately, it didn't change the ordinance. But the ordinance also didn't stop people like Arnold and shouldn't stop people like you and me from doing the right thing. You know, I was raised a Jehovah's Witness, okay? So I won't spend much time on this. I know that stuff bores you guys, but the thing about it is, enough about the witnesses to know that there were things that I believed growing up as a witness that challenged society. For example, I had to put up with a lot of in school because I didn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. I didn't sing the holiday songs. That kind of thing. So there was a certain amount of breeding in my religious upbringing that said you have to challenge the system when it is treading on you. But by and large, for the most part, we've got a lot of mainstream denominations, us, the Methodists, Baptists, Catholics, Episcopalians, Lutherans, you name it, these large mainline Christian denominations that have been around and are well established in the country for a long time, that typically don't have, or didn't until quite recently, have a lot of problems with what they believed versus how society ran. And so for years, I was taught this growing up too, even as a witness. It's the Christian thing to do to obey the law, right? You taught that, I'm sure. You taught that. Paul spoke about it in Romans chapter 13. But do you really think God believes that our laws are more important than his love? And the two will come into conflict at some point. And when they do, what do we do? There was a Christian mission, and these high school kids were taken on mission by their youth pastor, and they visited a little organization. It's in the South. I don't know if it was Alabama or Georgia, but it was basically a little. I don't want to say camp. It was a support organization that was taking in homeless immigrants. Okay? Homeless, illegal immigrants. Why? Because it knew that they were being oppressed and basically had no rights and were being hunted. And so what this organization was doing was simply trying to help them get a foothold on their lives in this country, trying to help them to find a place. Don't we all deserve a place? Yeah. And so they're just trying to get them to find a place. The mission ended. A couple days later, the church that sponsored the mission gets word that that organization had been shut down. It had been raided. Then came the news. The reason it had been raided is because a few of those high school students had promptly called the authorities when they learned of this mercy-filled, grace-giving group. Oh, the issue is not them being mercy-filled. The issue is not them perpetuating God's grace. The issue is they're breaking the law. And we as good Christians, we can't support that. I'll tell you where Jesus would be on that matter. Yeah. In Arizona, where we have a border with Mexico, Scott Warren, and this was 2018, 2019, he was part of a faith-based group called No More Deaths. Now, No More Deaths said it all for them, because what they were about is they lived there in a very tense border area. And they witnessed time and time again wasteless death as people were fleeing the South to get into our country And you can come up with all sorts of rationales as to why people have no business doing that. But the bottom line is, it is very easy to appreciate the reality that there are people that actually are fleeing for their lives. People that are at such desperate straits at the end of their rope that this is their last hope. And if that was you, do you think you're going to let a law about the border keep you from pursuing what you feel you absolutely need, what you feel your family absolutely needs? But many of these people were dying in the desert in the process for various reasons. Sometimes it was the people they trusted to get them over the border. The point is this: Scott and those in his group said enough's enough. I can't just stand by and watch people marching to their death in the desert. And so his group was about supporting people lost in the desert. They would go out, much like the Border Patrol themselves, to try to find people that were lost in the desert. And then they would bring them to a place of shelter and give them food and water and just life's basic necessities. They weren't promoting the immigration. They were trying to sustain life in danger. Scott got caught doing this, and he was threatened with 20 years. 20 years. He was branded a criminal. People who knew Scott as a great member of society yesterday are now hearing Scott as a criminal. It does wonders for your reputation and self-esteem. But Scott was doing absolutely nothing wrong. As a matter of fact, he was doing everything right in the eyes of Jesus. He didn't go to prison. He was acquitted. But how sad it is that we live in a society without doing anything about the matter, that it has to be a judge to make a ruling on whether or not the display of compassion and love to someone in need is legal or not. That's not a society that I really want to be a part of. I am. And I'm not going to reject that society because of its flaws, even though it disgusts me at times. But what I am going to do is, as a member of that society, I'm going to do my part in trying to steer it to enlightenment, to the idea that people, they come first. It's so easy to get caught up in that kind of thing. Inadvertently, back in 2016, Helen Berestang, she heard Trump's campaign. It resonated with her what he was saying about immigration, because the idea of kicking out all the bad hombres was something she thought was a great idea. She had bought into the idea that immigrants brought crime. And she said, well, okay, well, maybe we can do something about that. So she voted. 2017 rolls around. Immigration regulations have substantially changed. And she comes home to find her husband, who's been an immigrant in the United States for over 20 years, owns a restaurant, very, very positive member of his community, never committed a crime, is being deported. Roberto Berestang had become a victim of these new policies that she had inadvertently supported herself just because she hadn't thought through all the implications that were going to be involved. But that's exactly what we got to do, people. When somebody's suggesting a better way for our society, we have the responsibility to say, is it better for everybody? Is this better for humanity? Not, is this better for my kind of people? That's exactly what Jesus was against. Us falling in to that temptation of just worrying about my kind of people, my interests. So what do? We live in a society that's got its problems. It's got its inequalities. What about us? We're not tasting that firsthand, maybe. But are we willing to step out and make a proactive effort to deliberately taste it on behalf of others? That when we share in their burden, the numbers of those under that burden can grow to change the tide. I think that's where Jesus would be. Right there with those who suffer under the imbalances, injustices of society. Think about it. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.